June 1629. A Dutch East India Company ship called the Batavia cuts through the Indian Ocean, carrying over 300 souls and a fortune in silver toward the trading posts of Java. It's a routine voyage for the company, one of dozens that year. But just before dawn on the 4th of June, in complete darkness, the ship strikes a reef with devastating force. The impact tears through the hull. Within hours, the Batavia is breaking apart on the coral, and everyone aboard is fighting for their lives. Remarkably, most survive the initial wreck. 341 people make it off the dying ship and onto a cluster of small, barren islands nearby. These aren't tropical paradises. They're flat, exposed coral outcroppings in the middle of nowhere, part of what we now call the Abrolhos Islands off the western coast of Australia. There's limited fresh water. There are seals and seabirds for food, but not enough for everyone. Still, it could be worse. The ship's supplies wash ashore. Barrels of bread, wine, some tools. People start organizing. Shelters go up. Rescue seems inevitable. The Dutch East India Company is powerful. Someone will come looking. The ship's captain, Francisco Pelsart, makes a crucial decision. He takes the ship's longboat, a small group of men, and sets off to sail over 1,000 miles to Java to organize a rescue. It's a desperate gamble, but it's also the only real option. He leaves behind the vast majority of survivors, including the ship's senior merchant, a man named Geronimus Cornelis. On paper, Cornelis is now the highest-ranking company official on the islands. But there's no formal transfer of power. No ceremony. Pelsart simply leaves, and the survivors are left to figure things out for themselves. Here's where the story takes its turn. Geronimus Cornelis is not a sailor or a soldier. He's a merchant, an intellectual of sorts, well-educated and well-spoken. But he's also something else. Before boarding the Batavia, Cornelis had fallen in with a radical religious group back in the Netherlands, people who rejected traditional Christian morality, who believed that sin didn't really exist for the enlightened, that conventional rules didn't apply to those who truly understood the nature of the universe. It's unclear how deeply he believed all this, but what's certain is that he's ambitious, manipulative, and now, suddenly, in a position where normal constraints have vanished. At first, things seem relatively stable. People ration supplies. They collect rainwater. They wait. But Cornelis starts making calculations. He looks around and sees limited resources. He sees over 300 mouths to feed. And he starts thinking about what happens when a rescue ship arrives. Will there be enough water and food left for everyone? More importantly, will there be enough for him and the people he chooses to protect? He begins to see other survivors not as fellow castaways but as competition. As threats. As expendable. Cornelis starts gathering a small group of men around him. Not the respectable ones, not the company soldiers stationed on a nearby island. He chooses carefully. Young men, aggressive men, men with little to lose. He offers them protection, extra rations, a sense of belonging. He tells them that survival requires hard choices. That weakness is dangerous. That some people simply don't deserve to live. He's building a gang, essentially, but he frames it as necessary leadership. And slowly, quietly, violence begins. It doesn't start with open massacre. That would provoke resistance. Instead, people begin disappearing. A family sent to search for water on another island never returns. A man goes out to gather bird eggs and doesn't come back. Bodies aren't found, or when they are, deaths are explained away as accidents. Someone drowned. Someone fell. The islands are dangerous places, after all. People are frightened, but fear itself becomes a weapon. If you question too loudly, if you resist too openly, you might be next. So most stay quiet. They hope they're not on the list. They tell themselves that if they just keep their heads down, they'll be spared. Cornelis isn't doing all the killing himself. That's not how this works. He's directing it, authorizing it, creating an environment where murder becomes routine. The men he's gathered around him, they're the ones with blood on their hands, but they're acting with his blessing, under his orders. And here's the disturbing part. Some of them start to enjoy it. The violence escalates. What begins as calculated elimination of perceived threats turns into something darker. Killings become more frequent, more brutal. Women are assaulted. Children aren't spared. The pretense of necessity drops away, and what's left is raw cruelty. Over the course of weeks, more than 100 people are murdered. Think about that number. We're not talking about a single act of violence. This is systematic, sustained killing on a tiny cluster of islands where everyone can see and hear what's happening. And yet, for most of that time, there's no organized resistance. Why? Because Cornelis has done something very effective. He's created a hierarchy of fear. The people most likely to resist, the strong men, the soldiers, many of them are stationed on a separate island. The people left under his direct control are mostly women, children, the sick, the old. The men he's recruited are armed. They patrol. They watch. Resistance seems suicidal. But here's what Cornelis doesn't fully account for. Those soldiers stationed on the other island, they start hearing rumors. They see smoke signals that don't make sense. They notice that people who were supposed to bring supplies never arrive. A soldier named Weeb Hayes begins putting pieces together. He's not a high-ranking officer, but he's competent and, critically, he's beyond Cornelis's immediate reach. Hayes starts organizing his own group. They're undersupplied and outnumbered, but they're armed and trained. They start building defenses. They prepare for the inevitable confrontation. When Cornelis realizes there's a rival power center forming, he tries to eliminate it. He sends men to attack Hayes and his group. But these aren't random victims anymore. These are soldiers who fight back. The attack fails. Suddenly, Cornelis's control isn't absolute. There's a stalemate. His men control the main island and most of the supplies. Hayes controls a smaller island and has the moral authority of resistance. The situation is fracturing. Violence is no longer one-sided. It's becoming a civil war on these tiny specks of coral in the middle of the ocean. And then, after months of waiting, a sail appears on the horizon. The rescue ship has arrived. Pelsart has made it to Java, organized a rescue, and sailed back. For the survivors under Hayes's protection, it's salvation. For Cornelis, it's the end. He tries one last desperate gambit. When Pelsaert's ship anchors, Cornelis and his men row out to meet it, trying to present themselves as the legitimate authority, trying to spin a story where they're the heroes who maintained order. But Hayes and his men reach the ship too. The truth comes out. The bodies are found. The evidence is overwhelming. Pelsart is horrified. He's a company man, accustomed to order and hierarchy, and he's returned to find that his ship's wreck has spawned something like hell on Earth. He acts swiftly. Cornelis and his main accomplices are arrested. Trials are held, right there on the islands. There's no ambiguity about guilt. Confessions are extracted, often under torture, which is standard practice for the time. Sentences are handed down quickly. Cornelis and several of his chief lieutenants are executed on the islands. Hands are cut off first, then they're hanged. It's brutal, public justice meant to be a spectacle. Two of the youngest conspirators are marooned on the Australian mainland, the first Europeans forcibly settled there, left to an uncertain fate among indigenous populations. The surviving victims are taken aboard the rescue ship and transported to Java. But they're not the same people who left the Netherlands a year earlier. They've witnessed the collapse of everything they understood about civilization and human behavior. They've seen neighbors become murderers. They've learned that the thin layer of law and custom that keeps society functioning can vanish almost overnight. Some testimony from survivors suggests they were never quite right again, haunted by what they'd seen and experienced. The Dutch East India Company, for its part, wants the whole thing to go away. It's an embarrassment. A company ship, company employees, company authority, all of it falling apart into chaos and mass murder. The trials and executions are documented, but the story isn't widely publicized. Over time, the Batavia becomes known primarily as a shipwreck, a maritime disaster. The archaeology is fascinating. The treasure is valuable. The ship's remnants, eventually discovered and excavated centuries later, end up in museums. Beautiful displays of Dutch craftsmanship and the perils of early modern navigation. But what happened on those islands after the wreck, that gets less attention. It's uncomfortable. It doesn't fit neatly into stories of exploration and adventure. It's a story about what humans are capable of when structures disappear. When there's no police, no courts, no social pressure beyond immediate survival. It's a story about how quickly a community can turn on itself when someone charismatic and ruthless decides to seize control and when fear prevents collective action. The Batavia massacre raises questions we still struggle with. How much of our decent behavior depends on external enforcement? What happens to morality when authority vanishes? Why do people comply with evil when they outnumber the perpetrators? There were more victims than killers on those islands, significantly more. If they'd organized early, if they'd resisted collectively, the outcome might have been different. But they didn't. They waited. They hoped. They told themselves it wouldn't happen to them. And one by one, they were picked off. It's also a story about leadership, or the perversion of it. Cornelis didn't have formal authority. He took it. He built it through manipulation, through violence, through creating a system where compliance was rewarded and resistance was fatal. He convinced young men to do terrible things by making those things seem necessary, justified, even righteous. And for a while, it worked. His makeshift regime held together through sheer terror and the absence of any alternative power structure. The arrival of the rescue ship is almost anticlimactic. External authority returns, and suddenly the spell is broken. Cornelis goes from absolute ruler of his tiny kingdom to prisoner in chains in a matter of hours. The men who followed him, who murdered on his orders, they're executed or punished. Order is restored, but it's imposed from outside. It doesn't emerge organically from the survivors. They couldn't save themselves. They needed rescue not just from the islands but from each other. Today, if you visit the Western Australian Maritime Museum, you can see remnants of the Batavia. The ship's stern, beautifully reconstructed. Artifacts pulled from the wreck site. Coins, weapons, personal belongings preserved for centuries in the ocean. It's presented as a maritime tragedy, which it was. But it was also a human tragedy of a different kind. A case study in how fragile civilization really is. How quickly we can descend into barbarism when the frameworks we take for granted disappear. How fear and violence can dominate even when they're wielded by a minority. The Batavia survivors who made it back to Java carried those islands with them for the rest of their lives. They'd seen what people become without law. They'd learned that the monsters aren't always strangers or foreigners or others. Sometimes they're the merchant you sailed with, the young man from your hometown, the neighbor who seemed normal until suddenly he wasn't. They'd learned that survival isn't just about food and water. It's about maintaining the agreements, spoken and unspoken, that keep us from turning on each other. This isn't ancient history. The dynamics that played out on those barren coral islands in 1629, they repeat. Different contexts, different scales, but the same human elements. Authority collapses. Fear spreads. Someone ruthless seizes control. Violence becomes normalized. The majority complies out of terror or confusion or hope that they'll be spared. And when it's over, when order returns, everyone asks how it happened. How it was allowed to happen. The Batavia shipwreck is remembered. The name is known among maritime historians and enthusiasts. But the massacre that followed, that's often a footnote. Maybe because it's easier to think about a ship hitting a reef than to think about what happened next. Easier to focus on the maritime disaster than the human one. But the real story of the Batavia isn't about navigation failure or the dangers of the sea. It's about what happens when civilization disappears and fear replaces order. It's about the speed with which we can fall. And it's about the fact that, sometimes, we don't climb back out on our own. Sometimes we need rescue not from nature, but from ourselves. The Batavia reminds us that the distance between order and chaos, between civilization and savagery, is shorter than we'd like to believe. And that crossing that distance can happen faster than anyone thinks possible.